Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you so much for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, or wherever you're listening, such as iHeartRadio, or our wonderful archives. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, my guest is Mr. Robert Gill, Jr. He is a researcher, author, publisher, and business person, and is best known for the Art Molds Journal, a monthly glossy magazine on art and sculpture that he published before. Robert's previous book, 90 Days to Your First Real Estate Investment Purchase, is a guide to assist beginners with little money to invest in rental properties. And his most recent book, and our topic for today, is Happiness Power, How to Unleash Your Power and Live with a More Joyful Life. So that's the one we're going to actually focus on today. Also, something that makes Robert very happy is the fact that he's an avid sailor and lives in Ginger Falls. Oh, his dog is Ginger, and he lives in Far Hills, New Jersey. Thank you so much for joining us today, Robert.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you have a very diverse background. So I guess, you follow your interests. Let's talk a little bit about Art Molds Journal. What was that about?
Art Molds Journal was a monthly magazine where I interviewed sculptors and artists throughout the world, from Iran to Washington State. Those artists have appeared in the magazine. It lasted about 5 years before the interest in the magazine waned, and I put it to bed, but it's still circulating.
And that's a big job, because I've worked in publishing before myself, not as an owner of it, but just trying to get all that stuff together. We have one on Long Island called North of 25A. And it was similar about, artists and other interesting folks, and, High Gloss magazine. Boy, oh boy, that's becoming a thing of the past.
Yeah, my staff worked around the world, actually. I it was probably the first time that these people never came together. And many of them I really never met in person. And they all assembled the book, many of the writers, many of the photographers, and the editors.
So that was a big project.
Oh, yes.
And now you wrote a book, which is something very different. And I'm very interested to know how you came to a topic called Happiness Power.
Well, that came to me about almost 2 years ago now, just as the COVID crisis hit. I was reading in the New York...
Wait a minute. Has that been 2 years?
Well,
oh my God!
Almost,
it's
yeah,
getting there. It's getting there. You're right.
Because it's almost 2 years.
I have projects where I teach in person, various places, and that started to get changed to teaching online. So I think you're right, because it's coming around to the second time that those events are happening, and they're trying to decide to do it online, or it was going to be in person, but now with the uptick, oh my goodness, what a mess. Yeah.
Well, back then, I had no idea where this was going. And I was reading in the New York Times the results of a study, which was the World Happiness Report, which was put out by the United Nations, saying that the citizens of the United States were the unhappiest they'd been in 20 years.
Wow.
And this was just before the COVID was really hitting. So it was probably, the unhappiness was probably not caused by that. And I was saying, gee, that's interesting, because I'm a fairly optimistic person. And I thought to myself, why would that be? So I started doing some research on Google, and then that pulled me into a number of other issues because there were hundreds of studies on happiness, I learned, going all the way back to Aristotle, who was very interested in happiness and had his own opinions on it. And I thought, well, gee, this is fodder for a book. And as the quarantine came down on all of us, it gave me the impetus to say, well, okay, I'll stay inside and write this book. And that's how I did it.
So that was the timing, because you had time, because everybody's kind of quarantined inside. So you thought you would use this time wisely. And,
yes.
And then the topic about happiness came because you were inspired by this thing that you read that said that people in the United States are less happy than people elsewhere.
Yes, exactly. And what I started to find, there are many books about how to be happy and how to change your depression. But what I was discovering, as I said, the results of being happy were far more than just feeling good. And as I looked into it, I came up with 50 different powers that if you're happy, that you gain as a result of that. And I thought, geez, that's so interesting. And as I started the first half of the book, it discusses these various powers, which is really an incentive to want to be happy, besides being just feeling good about it. And then the last half of the book describes what to do, how you move forward for being happy. And the last chapter is the surprise ending, and that is that you really can't go out to directly find happiness. And that was the most interesting part of the entire studies, that happiness is found only indirectly. So it starts off with saying that a happier person is the one that's more successful in life. He tends to get a higher salary. He tends to be healthier, has lower blood pressure, has less heart attacks, and so on. I won't go into all the 50 units, but they are quite an incentive as to why you want to be happy.
Are what you're discussing now. These are the things through your research that you found was linked to a higher level of happiness.
Yes, you can divide them probably into four categories. There's the happiness which produces physical health, and happiness which is part of what self-kindness is all about, and happiness which develops your power of purpose. Those that find their power of purpose are the happier people in life. The happiness brought about by your friends and family, and the happiness brought about by the power of giving. Now, I don't mean giving necessarily funds and charity, although that's helpful. I mean getting in the elevator and offering someone a stranger a stick of gum. Just imagine the happiness that the stranger would have after he got over being a little suspicious, probably. But again, that gives you a shot of dopamine. And the studies show these little shots of dopamine from giving gives us that feeling of happiness, and also become habit forming.
What do you mean by become habit forming? Habit forming is usually a word that we associate with something negative.
Oh, I know that, but the chemistry of the brain creates certain feelings of happiness, and the endorphins and dopamine and oxytocin, they all flow as you're gaining happiness.
So they all flow. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, listen, there was just a recent study of a few days ago that was announced that how mice produce their own dopamine in anticipation of something good that's going to happen to them. So it's not that the good happened to them, it's their anticipation of it triggers the dopamine. So the dopamine apparently is coming first.
So to explain that more. What do you mean the dopamine is coming first?
Well, the brain is creating the chemical dopamine when we are anticipating something good or something that makes us feel good. The dopamine gives us the shot of that, and we feel even better about that.
There are ways to increase dopamine. There are many, many studies, as I'm sure you came across as you were studying to do this book. For instance, things like prayer, or if we can call it meditation, or a technique called mindfulness, and in fact, certain exercise systems, in particular yoga, actually have measurably increased dopamine.
Yes, I have a whole chapter on that because we talk about how do we gain our happiness, and mindfulness and prayer and all of those actions will create a happiness inside. That's part of the self-kindness that we have to practice on ourselves to create our happiness.
Yes, self-kindness, that's a good word. So do you find that people in the United States have less self-kindness? Is that one of the things, too, you finding that studies show there's less happiness?
Yes, that was one of the things that was surprising. For that, attached to self-kindness is self-esteem and self-worth, and the newer generations have less of that self-esteem and self-worth, according to the studies, which is not a good thing. As we gain our own sense of purpose in life, we also increase our self-esteem and our self-purpose. That the problem is that many of our young folks are really not finding their purpose in life.
Well, I wonder why that would be linked to the United States versus other countries, because it seems like right now there is so much turmoil, both political and personal, and there's lots of COVID lockdowns and otherwise really all over the world right now.
Well, no, it's not necessarily linked to the United States. It is worldwide. It just showed that in the U.S. it was a little lower. When you look at a study, you have to examine all of the data involved with the study. There is obviously certain allowances for errors as well. But when the study shows that it's been the lowest in over 20 years, it's really time to take pause as to what to do to correct that.
And I'd like to tell our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, and our guest today is Robert Gill, Jr., and we're talking about his book about happiness, which is called Happiness Power, How to Unleash Your Power and Live with a More Joyful Life. So, I'm wondering, Robert, we are calling you Robert Gill, Jr., as a matter of fact, but you actually are sharing with the audience, and it was confusing to me, that your actual name is Edmund McCormick. So why did you write the book, Happiness Power, under the pseudonym Robert Gill, Jr.?
A wise old author said to me a number of years ago, don't use your name. And I said, well, why is that? I've been kind of proud of my name. He said, no, because if your book fails, your name will fail. So I started my writing with Robert Gill, and luckily it's done well. So I'm schizophrenic now with two names.
Oh, so that gets confusing, right?
Yeah, it does. It does get confusing, but I'm happy to be called either.
Oh, okay. Because when I was scheduling the show, it was like one email was from Robert, and then I thought maybe one of the people, Edmund or Robert, was like, sometimes we have publicity agents, who book people. So I was like, what? Anyway, well, we'll call you Robert Gill for this show, because isn't that what Happiness Power, How to Unleash Your Power and Live with a More Joyful Life, is published under, so that people can find it. So, we'll stick with Robert Gill. That's Gill. And what's the junior about?
Well, because Robert Gill just sounded too plain, I just added that on.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your honesty. And I think that's an interesting footnote for Happiness Power. Now,
I'm sorry. I was going to say, one of the things that you asked me about, and I didn't mention, is what's causing our young folks to be less happier. And I was finding in my studies that it comes probably from two unsuspected sources. Number one, the telephone. The recent study by a company called Assyrian found that 66 of us check our phones 160 times a day. 65% of us sleep with their phones. 45% said they'd give up sex for a year rather than a phone. And 32% spend more time on their phone than a partner. Now, all of that can't be leading to greater happiness. In fact, I threw my telephone away 8 years ago. Even though I run two businesses, I don't run it with a cell phone. I run it with a landline. It took me a year to get used to not having the phone, but I'm happier without it. And the other thing that's causing...
Wait. Let's say that again. So you decided to give up a cell phone totally?
I walked into my doctor's office 8 years ago and saw all six people who were waiting there with their head in their cell phone. I thought I could take all the furniture out of this office here. No one would notice me because they were looking at their cell phone.
So don't you see that even at a table of a family sitting together or a group of friends together, everyone's in their own area of their cell phone. And that's not just in the United States.
That's everywhere, yes. And we're so less aware of what's going on around us as a result of that. And that's just I don't recommend that to anybody. I just recommend it to myself. And it just made me feel much happier and much better about myself. I'm not a slave. Remember, the cell phone is controlling us. You're not controlling the cell phone. You're being forced to do it. And every time you get a like on a cell phone or social media, there goes the dopamine again. A study showed that likes cause dopamine, and dopamine can be habit forming. And so the social media is also one of the reasons that happiness may be wavering.
Well, that could be. But that certainly is going on, all over the world. That's for sure. I mean, so you're saying from this increased isolation from everyone being super involved in their private life, and even just the electromagnetic fields generated by the cell phone all hours of all day, could be things that are linking to a lower happiness quotient.
Yes, one major studies have shown, and I'm sure you've seen this, that the more friends you have, and these are called actual friends, not the friends on social media. The more friends you have, the happier you are. The greater involved with the family that you are, the happier you are. And that requires being awareness of people and not of things. The interesting thing about happiness is that people who live more grateful lives are happier, as gratitude encourages altruism and altruist behavior.
So you're saying people who are happier tend to be more altruistic?
Tend to be more altruistic. And the reverse is true, too. You can be, if you're more altruistic, you are happier. The 6 to 7 things that you can do to make yourself happier is to be, one of them is to be altruistic, is the giving, is to showing gratitude. Gratitude builds friendships, to connect with friends and improve relations. to find out your purpose on earth. When you find out what your purpose in life is, you are much happier. That's why older people tend to be happier, because they found their purpose.
I think there's other reasons too. I know for myself, since I am an older person and getting older every day, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't say that I'm happier now, but I do think I have a deeper level of contentment. And what that comes from for me is that looking forward, I have less hurdles that I have to climb in order to feel self-satisfied. When I was young, I was, extremely aggressive at getting certain degrees and reaching a certain level of success. And I did all that already. I had a farm. I lived in the jungle. I had a very long list. I had a complete farm off the grid where my children were born, but they're now 46 and 42. I raised all my own food. Every single thing. I wanted to write books. I've written 16. So a lot of that stuff now, looking forward, I'm like, oh, okay. Not that I'm done with my list. I can put anything else on the list that I want, but I don't feel that pressure. So that's what I like about being older.
Precisely. But still, if you're content, you are more happy than you are unhappy.
Yes, that's true. But it also has to do, and I'm sure you have found this, and we are speaking today with Robert Gill, and we're talking about his book, Happiness Power, How to Unleash Your Power and Live a More Joyful Life, the things that can lead you. So how can someone check in to see if they're even happy or not? Not everybody even knows what that might feel like internally.
Well, that takes a little meditation and a little understanding. That's why I have that chapter in the book about meditation and prayer. You've got to look inward to yourself to start to understand yourself. And nowadays, it's much more difficult to look inward. We're so distracted by so many things. But being desirous to look inward is a way to know how you're feeling about yourself. Many people don't even know that.
Well, how do people check in to even know? I mean, sometimes they may think they're happy, but your kind of emotional self is blocked, and that can lead sometimes to even physical manifestations like stomach aches and rashes and headaches.
That's correct, and often you're unable to do that, and the only answer is to get a third party to talk to have that third party make observations about it. You're not able to see that all the time. We do have a habit of blocking what makes us unhappy and ignoring that. That's what counselors are for.
Well, that's true. And right now, I think that a lot of the therapists that I've spoken to are super busy, like never before. For one thing, everything's a double-edged sword. So when we look at something like this whole COVID incident, one thing that I think it created, which is actually very positive, is an increase in something called telehealth medicine. And that has opened up, particularly for therapists. They can now, in many cases, talk to people from anywhere in the country, and they're often willing to do that with either a very low fee and or that anyone's health insurance will cover them anywhere. So that opens up the availability to talk to a, trained therapist.
Yes, I agree. I've used that to contact my medical doctors. As a matter of fact, the only thing they can't do is put a stethoscope through the screen. But outside of that,
yes and no, because if you talk about that, you're talking about a stethoscope. That's a heartbeat, and there actually are totally available. You don't have a cell phone, but for anyone who does, there are very easy to use and inexpensive apps that the doctor can actually do, listen to your heart. You just hold it on there and they can listen to it from wherever. So even something like that is moving to be more mobile.
Yes, I understand. One of the things that I should have mentioned earlier is that happiness doesn't depend on what we have. It's how we feel about what we have. So the entire journey of seeking happiness is examining your feelings. There's an old, maybe even ancient Sufi story that really describes happiness. There was an old beggar walking the road to town, and a traveler walking in the opposite direction, passing the beggar. And as the two passed, the beggar held up this bag and he said, "I'm in this sorrowful, pitiful bag are all my worldly possessions." And with that, the traveler grabbed the bag out of this old man's hand and ran down the road ahead of him with it. And he circled around the corner and disappeared. And the old man dropped to his knees and wailed about losing his worldly possessions. And finally, he got up and walked down the road again toward the town. And lo and behold, in the middle of the road, there was his bag. And he screamed with joy about finding his worldly possessions again that he thought he'd lost. And in the bushes, the traveler looked out at this old man and he says, "See, that's how you make an old man happy." And the moral is the man thought he lost everything, and he described what he lost as being putrid and sorrowful, yet he was happy to gain it back again.
Well, that's a really, it's an important thing to know that state of happiness does fluctuate with things happen in life, grief following the death of someone, due to COVID or any other reason, and also having to move. That's big. So many people have been moving right now here in Florida. Oh my God. We went yesterday to the Motor Vehicle Bureau, and the line was 6 hours long because of the people relocating here. So,
oh my goodness,
yeah. And we don't even have the infrastructure to support that many people. So that's not great. I don't know if they'll be happier here or not, but it actually has to do with most people that were interviewed with the concept of self-choice about things like vaccination and wearing masks, because the government here in Florida is standing very firm about you can wear a mask and you can get vaccinated, but we're not going to mandate that. Well, in many other states, they are actually mandating it, and people are reacting that way to maintain personal freedom of choice.
Yes, and one of the things I worry about is that there'll be some people complaining that Florida will be sinking another 2 or 3 inches into the water because of all the people coming back.
I think you're right. So we have to bring this show to an end, but I wanted to thank you so much for the wonderful book you did. That's Robert Gill Jr. The book is Happiness Power: How to Unleash Your Power and Live with a More Joyful Life. And it's a good thing to take time and step back and evaluate your own happiness quotient, since we are in not only a pandemic, but a time of great stress. There's economic stress. There's the feeling of uncertainty. There's being relocated and dislocated out of your normal place of work and home. And, that all takes a toll. So checking in with a book such as Happiness Power is a really good idea. So thank you so much for being our guest today, Robert.
Thank you, Ellen, for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us once again right here on Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC or nearby Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, please email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai, at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.